And then
We don't say anything, hey?
okay, so without further ado. So hopefully people are somewhat familiar with Meister Eckhart. And so Meister Eckhart's theology is essentially based on this notion of ground or the Godhead. So if you have the Trinity, which is God, the Godhead is what lies beyond the Trinity. So this God and Godhead pair is the infinite ground of oneness, which is nothingness and has no cause. So when we say that God is infinite nothingness, we literally mean that God has no boundaries, God exists, but God is not substantive. So God does not stand in relation to anything. God has no boundary, no substance, no attributes. It's an absolute negation. And yet God exists. So in the negation of a negation, the ground of nothingness of God has a perfect and absolute essence of fullness and plenitude. And so Eckhart says, God created the world not out of any lack in God's self, which God hoped to fill up a why, but out of the welling up within God's self of God's own life, which spills over into creatures. Creation is the overflow, the spilling over of this inner life process into time and number and multiplicity. So there's no logical or conceptual explanation for creation other than that essence of perpetual fullness, which is of course inexhaustible because it comes from nothingness. So God has no why, God does not act for any reason outside God's self. And if we are one with God, then neither should we. So for this reason, he says, out of this innermost ground, all your works should be wrought without why. And here, we don't mean that we should act irrationally or arbitrarily, but rather that our actions should spring from this ground of God. So put another way, in Rob's favorite philosopher's theologian's way, John Caputo, all creation and its creatures are entirely dependent on God in the same way that a white thing cannot exist without the fundamental essence of whiteness as a potential, but all things have the essence of whiteness. And so two of his most well-known sayings are, my ground is God's ground and God's ground is my ground. And the other one, which I think is perhaps even more well-known, although I prefer the first one, is the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. So they are neither one nor two, but two in one unified ground, in the same manner in which waves are one with the ocean, and yet a wave is distinct from the ocean and it's finite. Next slide. So, in a similar way, Sunyata is the notion of emptiness in Buddhism, and it comes from the Madhyamaka tradition, which takes the Heart Sutra as its sort of fundamental truth. And the core of the Heart Sutra is expressed in the top line there, form is emptiness, and emptiness also is form. So emptiness is the negation of all concepts of anything permanent or independent, but it's not nihilism because it's not nothing, it's nothingness. So in spite of the negation of everything, phenomena bear like an ontological mark. They bear the mark of what we call suchness or isness, which is the affirmation of form. So emptiness is a negation and form is an affirmation. And they're dynamically identified. So it's not a spectrum, but they're contradicting statements that are identified and dependent on each other. So reality does not stand in relation to anything. There are no subjects or predicates. There are no concepts or labels or codifications that we can make about phenomena. There are no boundaries to reality. It is infinite nothingness. We cannot say anything about reality other than it exists as it is. In this way, it can be said that the nothingness of emptiness is not nihilistic because it is full of suchness. So often we interpret the verb is with sameness. So if A is B, then A is equivalent to B. Conversely, if this is not the case, then A is not B. However, this is predicated on binary logic, and Buddhism is non-dualistic and it doesn't obey binary logic. It's neither rational nor irrational, but non-rational. So in the case of emptiness, A is B without A being equivalent or identical to B. As emptiness, as I said, is a dynamic identity rather than an equivalent identity. So form as affirmation and emptiness as negation are both codependent and co-affirming. So if we have two mirrors reflecting each other, the result is an infinite codependent series of reflections. Infinite because the mirrors endlessly affirm the reflection of the other mirror. And so sometimes this gets expressed mathematically. And so D.T. Suzuki, who was he was a Buddhist who was heavily involved in spreading Buddhism to the West in the 60s, says infinity equates to zero. But you also see this actually in Nicholas of Cusa, who's actually one of my favorites. Nicholas of Cusa expresses everything, all of his theology, which is very similar to Meister Eckhart's, as the maximum is the minimum. So mathematically, this would be incorrect, but non-dualistically, the statement is possible because zero and infinity are both concepts that are unrelated or unpredicated. As soon as you compare something to infinity or to zero, it doesn't work, right? You can take as many steps as you want towards zero or towards infinity, but you'll never ever get there because you can always take another step. So they're rationally unquantifiable. They can't be comprehended on the basis of comparison. So anytime we try to conceptualize zero or infinity in a solidified way, they elude us. But they belong to the same sphere of non-rational concepts and thus can be equated because they're both unrelated. Next slide. Don't panic. Take a deep breath, have a sip of coffee. I know that was a lot. And I've tried to spread this out so that if there's lots of room for questions at the end, if anybody has any questions. But if this is new to you, it may not immediately make sense from 5 minutes of me talking. So, all right, next slide. How am I doing on time here? Okay. So the problem with paradox. So the thing about emptiness is that various Buddhist traditions are more or less dogmatic about saying something about emptiness, because the problem with paradox is that as soon as you start talking about it in any substantive way, you're going to violate it subtly by either emphasizing emptiness, the negation, or you're going to subtly emphasize form or the affirmation. And therefore, you know, you've committed this great sin by violating the paradox, right? So different traditions have different stances on how much we can talk about it. And so this is where Zen cones come from, the as Michelle puts it, the logic defying riddles, you know, what is the reason that the patriarch came to the west, the oak tree in the front of the garden? Because that is the only way to point to the paradox without actually talking about the paradox. But the fact is that we do already engage in discourse about it. I'm doing it right now. There have been papers written. We do engage in discourse about it. And, you know, if you teach, you know, in a master-student relationship in Buddhism, if you're going to teach someone about emptiness, often you do it outside of Zen koans, right? But if we accept Sunyata as the foundation of the Madhyamaka school, we've already violated it by making it a thing or an idea or a concept. So you end up with this weird sort of Sunyata sickness where in one sense, in every practical way, it's the fundamental truth of the Sunyata school, and yet it's not a thing. It empties even itself. So even itself is non-conceptual, but in every practical way it is. So you end up in this bind. So like I say, in every way, it's the highest truth. And yet we have to deny that it is. So my response to this is that we humbly accept that if we're going to talk about it, and we do, that we just accept that we're going to violate the paradox in some way. And we just justify which side we violate it on. And admit that we are violating it rather than trying to pretend that we're sustaining it. Next slide. I might come back to this one, so just jump ahead a couple. Keep going. Okay, so I'm going to start with sort of the most prominent example that I looked at in my research. So Ueda Shizuteru is the inheritor of the Kyoto school, which is it's an interesting sort of philosophical school that aims to sort of integrate continental and Eastern philosophy into just sort of one whole broader look. And Ueda did his doctoral dissertation on Meister Eckhart in German. And so when he published his dissertation, I think it was his supervisor said that he should add a chapter on Eckhart and Zen. So this is what he did. And at the beginning of this, he compares two paintings. So this is the first painting. It's by Joachim Bachler, and I may not be saying that properly because I'm not Dutch. But it's essentially Martha and Mary in the kitchen.
The kitchen.
Yes, yes. And so that this is heavily influenced by Eckhart's sermon on Martha and Mary in the kitchen. Because the traditional understanding, or I should say not the traditional, but the conventional or more immediate reading is that Mary is the one who is sort of wise and virtuous and more associated with God. But Eckhart flips this and says that it's Martha. So this is why you see Martha in the foreground. She's the prominent one, right? And in the background, like way, way in the background, yeah, there is Jesus and Mary, okay?
Mhm.
And so Eckhart critiques this, Ueda critiques this for a number of reasons. Essentially, he says that in order for it to truly resemble Zen, God would have to completely unbecome, and Jesus would have to be gone from the picture altogether. But in my mind, this is just asking a monotheist or a panentheist, depending on how you want to look at it, to be a non-theist, which is not going to happen. But the really interesting part, next slide, is when he compares it to the sixth patriarch of Zen. So and the painting is on the right there, and it's just a man in his bamboo. And he goes into a great deal talking about this. And he says, however, this is no solipsistic self-absolutization of the man. To the contrary, in virtue of first becoming completely empty and annihilated, he has come to himself as he works in this way and is dependent upon nothing. The man is the nothing. He is himself, but from the outset, his self has been completely penetrated by the emptiness. That means in the emptiness, the man himself is completely empty. So for Ueda, the man is annihilated. That's a pretty, like, it's got nihilism, the root of nihilism in the word, right? So my argument is that Ueda subtly emphasizes negation. So all that remains of the man is the shred of him being himself. The affirmation that he is himself is overshadowed and qualified by the fact that from the outset, he's been completely penetrated by the emptiness. Like, and in the last sentence of the quote, there is no affirmation even that he is himself, only that he's completely empty. So Ueda also says about the painting that through his work and as his work, the world whirls, which I don't disagree with. Yes, it's lovely. But my critique is that there's nothing in the painting to show the world whirling. The world consists of more than just the man, but there are no birds, an empty sky, no trees, just the man and his bamboo. Ueda also says that the universal relation itself is not a pre-existing order, and this is what he's saying about Eckhart's theology, a pre-existing order of being, but rather a dynamic event of being in relation to and with one another. And again, I don't disagree, but if this is the case, then why is the man so utterly alone in the painting? If the world is worlding and the man is working as he works, there's also the mountainness of the mountains, the treeness of the trees, and the skyness of the sky. So that pure immanence, because Buddhists will talk more about immanence than transcendence, so that pure immanence is as much expansive as it is contracted. His vision is a very contracted immanence. And so in the absence of this expansive immanence, we lose an aspect of the affirmative nature of suchness that results in a much more stark and austere solitude than a full one. If, as Ueda says, everything depends on the unity of an infinite negation and a simple affirmation, the simplicity of the affirmation, because the adjective associated with affirmation is simple, is engulfed by the infinitude of the negation, right? So next slide. Maybe, there we go. And you can really see it in this quote here. So he says, now with the unbecoming of God into nothing, the human being, God's son, as well as the life of God, dies. It is a great death, as it is called in Zen, the most extreme self-alienation of the human being. There is, to speak of with Eckhart, a desert where no life lives anymore, neither human nor divine, where no creature can glean as it would in God. In the pure nothingness in which God and the human being unbecome together, the rose is also completely annihilated. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the rose is the Angelus Silas poem. The rose is as it is, it blooms as it blooms. So it's clear from this vivid description of annihilation, desert and death, that Ueda finds liberation in the negational aspect of Sunyata. But if not only God and man are nothing, but if the rose is annihilated too, what's left? Ueda might say a nothing but the man cutting his bamboo, but this seems insufficient cause to me to celebrate the complete annihilation of everything else. A liberation worthy of complete annihilation can only be an all-encompassing affirmation that amounts to more than a man cutting bamboo. In some sense, it seems as though Ueda finds his liberation through the great death alone, but I would argue that the value of the great death lies in what is revealed in a complete stripping, and that is the all-embracing compassion of suchness. And so this is the crux of my critique right here, that bottom quote. He says, Zen Buddhism breathes the same spirit as Meister Eckhart's mysticism, but the former leads the spirit to a much more radical consequence, just as much on the way of negation as well as on the way of affirmation. And I don't think that's true for Ueda. I might concur that Eckhart lies more on the side of affirmation, but I don't think that he has sustained the paradox. I think he has subtly emphasized the way of negation. And so this is my critique. Just if you find liberation in the negational aspect, that's fine, but just acknowledge that instead of trying to pretend that we've sustained the paradox. Next slide. So, an affirmative Sunyata, and this was a really hard part to tie in because in order to completely explain it, I also need to explain Shin Buddhism, which I really don't have time for.
We'll Google it.
Yeah. Well, that was why I almost said reading, but anyway. So there is a way in which the paradox is a perfect paradox, but it is also outside of linear dualistic time. The negation is antecedent to the affirmation. And you can see this in the ordering of the Four Noble Truths. So the Four Noble Truths start with suffering, and then they go to the cause of suffering, and then they go to the way like around suffering or through suffering, and arrive at the end at liberation, right? And liberation is the affirmation. And they're always ordered in this same order. You can't do them out of order. And so often when we're talking about non-duality and emptiness, you can say that you have moments of realizing suchness. That is Martha in the kitchen, right? But in a way, this is also dualistic to say that we have moments of non-duality and moments of duality. So I'm saying there is a larger non-duality. And I think that's what Eckhart's breakthrough is in Sermon 87. It's the larger non-duality of duality and non-duality. You have to come to the kitchen however you come to the kitchen. But this larger non-duality is so all-encompassing and so embracing that it inherently has to contain compassion. And so the consequences of all this is affirmation. And yes, it's a violation of the paradox. But we've established, in my opinion, that this is unavoidable. And so the other example that I had is Suzuki and Merton in The Birds of Appetite and Wisdom and Emptiness. And I think that they actually never quite meet for the same reason that Suzuki subtly emphasizes negation, and what Merton cannot get over is is the lack of affirmation. He calls Zen, and this is not like a criticism by Merton, but he calls it ruthless and austere, right? And so the difference between Suzuki and Merton and Ueda and Eckhart is because of the emphasis on affirmation or negation. But Suzuki and Ueda are both predominantly giving you a negational vision of Sunyata. And when you have an affirmative Sunyata, Eckhart comes actually much closer to Buddhism. And so this is the final chapter of my thesis, is essentially showing what an affirmative Sunyata looks like. And like I say, I've gone into a little bit here, but it's very difficult to do without getting into a whole nother set of metaphysics. So, slide. How are we doing?
Want back to those other channels?
I can. How do people feel?
Is that the end, or is that just a little break for you?
No, that was the end. I was trying to leave a lot of room for discussion, but people may be bored, or maybe people want the other example. You want the other example? Okay, go back to the.
I like a good dose of metaphysics for breakfast.
I could live off of metaphysics.
This is the process of negation leading to affirmation, going backwards to get to that.
No, you went too far.
One more.
There you go. So wisdom and emptiness is a dialogue between Trappist monk Thomas Merton and D.T. Suzuki. And they maintained this lovely little relationship in this dialogue. And so Suzuki says, the Zen master will therefore tell us to transcend or cast away the experience itself, to be absolutely naked. And then, and only then, do we find ourselves again to be the ordinary Toms, Dicks, and Harrys we had been all along.
Mm.
And he's actually talking about this in response to Eckhart's breakthrough, which in my opinion, he's misunderstood because of the vivid imagery in Eckhart's language in the breakthrough. He doesn't understand that that's exactly what Eckhart is talking about. And so Merton responds by talking about purity of heart and union with Christ. And so often on the Christian side, he says, we identify personality with ego, and he means ego in the Buddhist sense, which is certainly not the true Christian person. On the Buddhist side, there seems to be no positive idea of personality at all. To be the Tom, Dick, or Harry we have been all along seems to correspond to a Christian losing his old man and finding his true self in Christ through purity of heart. So you can see, again, it's not affirmative enough to be nothing other than Tom, Dick, or Harry, and for that to be it is not enough for Merton. So just flip to the next slide. Oh, you went back.
Yeah, the structure.
Oh, yeah. There we go. So later in the dialogue, Suzuki gives another example of it's a Zen koan, but it's not quite a one-liner Zen koan. So the student says, "What is Tao?" And Tao is just, you can think of it as ultimate reality. And the teacher's response is, "It is one's everyday mind." And the student says, "What is one's everyday mind?" And the response is, when tired, you sleep, when hungry, you eat. And I do not dispute that when we experience Sunyata, liberation, or divine wisdom, we simply exist in its naked being. The problem comes in the final answer of the koan. When tired, you sleep. When hungry, you eat. Is that what liberation is? To truly experience and accept the everyday, to return after the breakthrough to the realm of Tom, Dick, and Harry. When tired, we find refuge and rest in sleep. When hungry, we relish the satisfaction of eating. In grief, in spite of any equanimity we may have or acceptance of existence, it's still personal and it's still effective. And so even there's affirmation in affectivity, even if it's a negative affectivity, right? So part of the distinction between theism and non-theism lies in the conflation of non-theism with the impersonal and non-affective. But it's entirely possible to have a non-theistic ontology that is both personal and affective. And that's what I'm arguing for. So to erase the affectivity of naked being is to destroy our sacred humanity. Regardless of our everyday experience as painful or joyful, there is affirmation in its affectivity. As the Zen koan goes, actually it's not a Zen koan now that I look at it, it's a Lojong slogan, so it's actually from Tibetan Buddhism, but it still remains. Do not squander your life. Or in Jesus' words, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. And so, and Merton, I'm actually on the same page as Merton. So Merton responds to Suzuki's koan by saying, for the Buddhist, life is a static and ontological fullness. For the Christian is a dynamic gift, a fullness of love. And so again, he goes back to personality, or it's an ontological argument. There's not enough ontology for Merton, and ontology in the Buddhist realm is suchness. There's not enough suchness. There's not enough affirmation. So from the metaphysical point of view in Buddhism, seems to take emptiness as a complete negation of all personality, whereas Christianity finds in purity of heart and unity of spirit a supreme and transcendent fulfillment of personality. So again, you can see it's a similar sort of thing as Ueda and Eckhart. And that is all I have for you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I just definitely there. Go.
So, I love this. So, I love the idea of an effective, the fact that you try to articulate an affirmative shunyata on the basis of affectivity, which of course, and I know we've had this discussion, it begs the entire question of the whole discussion of the spiritual senses. And the literally a phenomenology of the opening of the body to the spiritual realm, and how it continues to be sensuous even in the spiritual realm with the awakening of the spiritual senses. So there's a certain sense in which any language that is going to remain faithful to the paradox cannot speak of the experience, but must speak out of the experience, in which case you're talking poetry, not philosophy, right? Although in Heidegger's later work, which of course the Kyoto School loved, was all based on creating a new kind of vocabulary, and he tried his hand at poetry and he was dreadful. But he actually, wrote some pretty decent, philosophy trying to create a new language which spoke out of it rather than of it. Yeah. So my question for you is, because I'm not really familiar with the Buddhist literature on that idea. How do Buddhists of the Kyoto school use Heidegger and use the concept of speaking out of it rather than because I'm suspecting that what Ueda is trying to do is speak out of it rather than speak of it. But maybe he's not really all that success. Maybe he's a bad poet too, sort of thing. Right? So are there any Buddhist thinkers that you know that are doing this successfully? And with an inclusion of the concept of the spiritual senses.
Yeah, so Ueda was a good example for me to critique because Ueda, in my opinion, does not try to speak out of this experience. He tries to speak about it. But actually, Nishitani is the one you want to read. Nishitani, it speaks far more to the experience. So, and he is by far the most famous of the Kyoto school. And I believe, I'm trying to remember, I think he might have done his dissertation on Schelling and not Heidegger. But if you read chapter 1 of Religion and Nothingness, he has this like very, very vivid description. And Bishop John knows because I actually sent it to him. He has this very, very vivid description of what religion is, and he uses Dostoevsky's House of the Dead to do so. And Dostoevsky talks about, witnessing this like woman down by the river and the steps and all of this sort of business and calls it God's world, like the unfurling of the smoke, from the huts, right? And so Nishitani speaks from it more than Ueda does. And he still, like he calls, I can't remember whether it's Sunyata or Buddhism, but he calls it personally impersonal.
Okay, I'll look up.
Yeah, Nishitani is the one you want to read.
So how come you didn't include Nishitani here? Since he seems to, support what you're saying.
Because he's not fully affirmative. It's an easier argument to make, like academically, with the examples that I use, and you know what they are, with the poetry of Saichi, right? Than it is with Nishitani. It was simply, and like it's easier to make an academic argument that way. Yeah. Okay.
That's fair. I have a question.
Yeah.
About creation. I'm sometimes I don't hear quite correctly now. Did you say that creation as an outpouring of what?
Of nothingness.
Yeah. I was greatly influenced in theology by the process theologians based on Whitehead's philosophy. And the concept of they've developed that term panentheism to decide on that process. But creation pouring out of nothingness is the overflowing of non-being into being or something of that nature. Sometimes that doesn't make much logical sense to me.
It shouldn't make a logical sense.
I think it should, Yeah. I think that's a question that that we really have to deal with. I find reading some of the contemporary atheists never deal really with that question of being, non-being, and how things come to be. And people nod and, and so on. But there's something behind that has to make some kind of sense. We have to understand. Now, I'm fully aware that the Eastern mind thinks about. I mean, I like that concept of no thingness. But like for a Buddhist, what is it that passes from one life to another that sustains that flow of whatever it is, the energy or something? How would you? I mean, I think that's what it seems to me. That's what the Western mystics are always looking for, to penetrate that cloud of unknowing. And I know I mean, I don't know very much about Buddhism, but I know a little bit, and Hinduism, and there's a question in there that seems to me that we have to struggle with in order to, at least from my mind, from the way that I was trained and I'm brought up. There's how that area there between no thingness and thingness and how that, I think there's an area in there that bothers me, that a lot of people, a lot of the modern atheists go back to a certain point, but they don't take that up, they don't get into that other area. So I was interested how this overflowing of no thingness becomes thingness, and because you're a thing and I'm a thing, we can be touched, and that's the question that I would like to explore.
Well, I'll say first of all, it's interesting you bring up Whitehead because so Whitehead's ideas are very, very similar to the Buddhist doctrine of codependent origination. Okay. And it's funny also that you mentioned him because I was just reading more about him because I was just falling down a rabbit hole. But, and I don't know if this answers your question, but so you're talking about no thingness in
Becoming
relation
thingness.
to thingness, right? And so you're saying like, I'm a thing, that computer is a thing, right? But for Buddhists, it's not a thing. It's computerness.
I understand,
Does that make sense? Sort of?
it doesn't make sense to me, but it might
Yeah.
make sense to Buddhists generally.
Yeah,
There's not the same distinction between thingness and nothingness, like it's
yes, yeah,
something else.
I think that's the basic. I mean, I think mysticism is I mean, I think the mystics of Buddhism, I know again very much about them, but I know a little bit about the mystics of Christianity. And I know that they're looking for an answer to a question which is unanswerable or something, it's answerable, but it somehow or other has to jive with, I don't know, rationality or something like that.
but that's
Because
that's the problem, is that in order that, to me, at least anyway, and Buddhism works this way a lot, we don't deal a lot with rational knowledge. We deal with insight, right? And insight is a form of knowledge, but it's not rational. And so to try and understand it rationally is never going to work because, like I was saying, it doesn't obey any kind of rationality. It has to be understood almost intuitively.
Like with the concept of Tao, there's a rationality, seems to me, that you act according to nature. You fall, or I remember we had a Chinese philosopher. He used to tell us, when he was talking about the Tao, it's normal for a drunk man to fall down. So if a drunk man falls, it falls according to the law of nature and doesn't hurt himself. But if you're sober, you resist the fall and you break a bone or so it's kind of acting with, it seems to me there's a rationality to it, that nature, you act according, you kill in the fall, you plant in the spring, you rise with the tide, you fall, there's that's what I see as the Tao. Is that how you would interpret it?
I mean, yes and no. Like what you're talking about is more non-action or and Michelle would be able to say more about this than I would, but I would call it Wu Wei. The Tao is the Tao that cannot be named is not the original Tao, is not the true Tao. So
The Tao that can be named.
or the Tao that can be named, sorry, yes. The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. But what you're saying does have relevance because it's associated with Taoism. And it's associated with Eckhart too.
I got so many things. But just kind of tapping onto that, because I was thinking how when you were speaking about the paradox, and now you're talking about the Tao that can't be named, the Tao that is named is not the true Tao. It's very much like Christian theology or Jewish theology that says the minute you think you know who God is, you don't know God. And that's where I think both East and West sort of kind of come together. Well, I've got these two images in my head. I'm trying to make sense of them. So help me out. One is of a black hole, and everything is just being sucked into the black hole, and everything's just being annihilated.
Or recreated.
And that's the thing, and that's where I'm going. That's where I'm going. The other image is the black hole from the other side is out of nothingness is coming everything that's just been sucked in, and it's an overflowing of fullness. So one is Godhead, ground of everything, and the other is Buddhist nothingness,
I think that's a really,
or the same thing, just look from two sides.
I think that's a really, really good image because the image I always have in my head is of an empty cup that somehow has water spilling over it. But that's almost a better image.
You're welcome.
And it's fine, like, I'd be curious to ask Michelle what she thinks, but I would say that we don't often express it in those terms in Buddhism. That language is more associated with Eckhart, and yet at the same time, I think there's like a lot of parallels there, right? So, and like one of the things that I talk about is like, so even though like my affirmative Sunyata bears like is much closer to Christianity than the ones that I critique, like I still maintain that it's not syncretistic. They're not the same thing. They never will be, but they're just very, very close.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, anybody online have a question before we?
No.
Someone was applauding.
Oh, maybe. Oh, has a question.
I'm trying not to be overwhelmed, right? But this presentation is asking a lot of questions. So it seems so wide and so deep. But I'm trying to find a balance by trying to look into the book of John, chapter 1 to 15. And it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing was made that was made. It's like putting everything that the image that is coming to me is like putting things together, right? Then when you put them together, it has a beautiful meaning. Then you are now trying to be inquisitive. You know, that why, oh, I didn't know this till it's going to be this beautiful. Okay, let me dismantle the formation again and see. Don't be surprised that when you dismantle it, you are trying, if you are not trying to bring it back together, it will not give you the same image as it was before you dismantle it. But I'm so impressed to see through the lens. It has so many angles, theological. This is the theological aspect of it. It has a kind of anthropological lens to it as well, in the sense that woman should, if the theory, the concept of this presentation is exhumed, we will now, I think it's even for we Christian, I think it helps us a lot. You know, you try to bring yourself into pieces and bring yourself back in. Either Buddhist or Christianity and other religions, even Islam, what joins everything together is the word. So it's either the word is from God or it's from human being, but it is the word. Because when an organization is formed, you make rules. How do you make those rules? Pronunciation, words. And that is what John chapter 1 is saying, that without the word, right? Without the word, nothing was made, and that is the emptiness. When you take things out, you are empty. And it gives us the third one is the spiritual aspect of it. That is what really moves me. The spirituality of this concept teaches us that our focus should not be on anything than to serve humanity. Because without that, we don't have a purpose. And without purpose, we don't exist. And that is our emptiness. But we don't want to be empty. That is why we have to do something. Right? And if I look at Suzuki's meaning to the Zen master, right, says that to be absolutely naked, right, we should consistently see ourselves as being naked. Then we can have this spiritual compulsion to put ourselves together to serve the purpose of God, right? And I move forward to look at what is Tao. So it is one's everyday mind, right? And it says that when hungry you eat, When tired, you sleep. But can we just be doing that every day? If we're getting hungry and eating and getting tired and sleeping, what is our purpose?
So there's a lot of things I could touch on in that, but I think part of what you're talking about is like, so we say we should be naked. But part of Eckhart, and if you read Sermon 87, is that it's almost like, so when we try to do good, when we have a purpose, when we strive to do certain things, it's coming from the wrong place. It has to be from the ground of God, which is without a why. It has to be spontaneous. Ground is ground. Oh, groundless ground. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And his idea, and this is part of the breakthrough, is that, we start out, and I describe it like walking a circular path, but my supervisor, who may use Wittgenstein to talk about this, but I'm not sure, calls it climbing a ladder and then kicking out the ladder from underneath.
Wow,
you.
that image came into my mind. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I describe it as a circular path. So first you leave your house and you go to seek God, emptiness, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? And in this journey that you realize that you should be completely naked, you discover Eckhart or whatever. And so then you end up with this problem of the will not to will. Well, how do I be naked without striving? Because being naked means not trying and not striving. So you're caught in this will not to will. But Eckhart's breakthrough is you let go of all of that. You let go of all of that. You let go of even the will to know God. And then is when the breakthrough happens. And that was part of the reason why I tied it to Shinran, Shonin, and Shin Buddhism, is because so similar, like you can call this same idea ego in Buddhism. And so, you're supposed to overcome your ego, right? And when I say ego, I don't mean like self-inflation, although it can be that. It's just this very sense of like this sense of self, right? But in order to do that, you still have to try. You still have to somehow work the problem. So then you're not doing it by trying to do it. And so what Shinran Shonin said, and this is the reason why Shin Buddhism was founded, is he said, you know what? I went up in that monastery and I meditated for 20 years and I am no further ahead. The fact is that we can never, ever crack the shell of ego. So and this is why Shin Buddhism is more similar to Christianity, because then it becomes this, I am taking refuge in Amida Buddha, which you can call the groundless ground. And I am grateful because through that vow, which I won't get into the vow, that problem of ego is solved.